Indie games have come a long way. From small passion projects to some of the biggest, most beloved games out there. Today, we're looking at the ones that went toe-to-toe with AAA giants and actually won. Some of them sold millions, some won awards, and some just hit differently. But all of them outshined the big budget competition one way or the other. This isn't a ranked list or a definitive top 15 because honestly, narrowing it down was hard enough. Let's start with the obvious one. Minecraft. We all know it, we've all played it, and it's easy to forget that this juggernaut started out as a small indie project from one dude, Marcus Persson, aka Notch. It didn't have flashy graphics or a marketing campaign, just blocks, creativity, and a surprisingly addictive survival loop. Around its full release in 2011, it was already selling millions on PC, while AAA heavyweights like Battlefield 3 and Skyrim were dominating headlines. Yet Minecraft's player-driven growth consistently rivaled or exceeded those hits. And it wasn't just keeping up, it was quietly building something even bigger. Fast forward to today, and it's the best-selling game of all time, with over 300 million copies sold, and it's still getting regular updates. It basically redefined what indie success looks like. And more than that, it helped prove that you don't need a massive budget to become one of the biggest games in the world. That's not just impressive for an indie game, that's legendary. Among Us. Among Us originally launched in 2018 with barely a ripple. Small indie team, quiet mobile release, and no marketing push. But in 2020, while the world was locked inside, the game exploded. And suddenly it was everywhere. Twitch, TikTok, YouTube, classrooms, memes, Halloween costumes, you name it. What's wild is that it completely outshined massive online games at the time. Even Call of Duty Warzone and Fortnite saw big streamers switch over. It peaked at 500 million monthly players, more than any AAA title that year. And it did it with basic graphics, one map, and an idea so simple it was genius. It quite literally dwarfed AAA games in player count. For perspective, even one of the most hyped game, Cyberpunk 2077 sold 13 million copies in its launch month, but Among Us still had over 200 million players that same month. And despite being built by a team of just 3 people, it reshaped the social deduction genre and proved that timing, accessibility, and creativity could outperform billion-dollar marketing. Among Us didn't just compete with big titles. It eclipsed them, at least for a while. Five Nights at Freddy's. Five Nights at Freddy's launched in 2014, right around the same time as AAA horror titles like Alien Isolation and The Evil Within. But while those were pushing cinematic tension and big-budget scares, FNAF went the other direction. Minimal gameplay, static cameras, and animatronics that got uncomfortably close. And somehow, it managed to be way more unsettling and creepier than it should have been. Built by a single developer, Scott Cawthon, the game exploded through streamers and YouTubers, turning into a phenomenon almost overnight. It spawned sequels, spin-offs, merch, fan theories, and even a movie deal, all while most people assumed it wouldn't last beyond one Halloween season. What makes it wild is that it actually outperformed some of the biggest horror franchises around in reach, longevity, and fan obsession. And it did all that while outshining horror games that had 100 times the budget. It's the game that basically rewrote the indie horror playbook, and a reminder that sometimes less really is more. Cuphead. Cuphead made a pretty unforgettable first impression. Hand-drawn animation straight out of the 1930s, jazz soundtrack, and classic run-and-gun gameplay. It looked like something Disney might have made if Disney was trying to punish you. It was released in 2017, going up against heavy hitters like Assassin's Creed Origins, Horizon Zero Dawn, and Destiny 2, all big cinematic games with massive budgets. Meanwhile, Cuphead was developed by 2 brothers and a small team who literally remortgaged their homes just to keep the project alive. And even without flashy trailers or open worlds, it grabbed attention immediately. Critics praised it, players loved it, and it went on to sell millions, won major awards, and eventually got its own Netflix series. Cuphead even won Best Art Direction at the Game Awards, beating out nominees like Breath of the Wild and Horizon Zero Dawn. In a year packed with massive releases, Cuphead stood out by doing something completely different, and doing it really well. Fall Guys. Fall Guys dropped in mid-2020, and for a little while, it was everywhere. A 60-player obstacle course battle royale with jellybean physics and bright colors. It was simple, weirdly addictive, and completely different from the gritty shooters that dominated the space. It dropped while Call of Duty Warzone was dominating and Among Us was just about to blow up, and somehow it still found its own spotlight. Made by a small UK studio, Fall Guys hit over 7 million sales on Steam in its first month and became the most downloaded PlayStation Plus game of all time. And at one point, it even became one of the most watched games on Twitch. On top of that, it brought in $185 million in digital revenue on PC alone, making it the most successful PC launch since Overwatch in 2016. And it did all that without guns, squads, or kill streaks, just ragdoll physics, pastel colors, and game show vibes. It wasn't chasing realism or deep mechanics, just chaos, fun, and a lot of falling over. Hollow Knight. Hollow Knight was made by a 3-person team from Australia, originally crowdfunded on Kickstarter, and somehow delivered a world that felt bigger, more mysterious, and more rewarding than some open-world games with 100 times the budget. It came out in 2017, the same year as Breath of the Wild and Horizon Zero Dawn, so it was easy to miss at first, but word of mouth kept it alive. By 2019, it had sold close to 3 million copies, eventually clearing 5 million, and it's still one of the highest-rated games on Steam to date. People just latched onto the lore, the secrets, the challenge runs, and a lot of folks are still waiting on its next iteration like it's Half-Life 3. It's often hailed as one of the best Metroidvania games ever made, indie or otherwise, and honestly, a few AAA games from that year didn't age nearly as well. Balatro. Balatro launched in early 2024 without much build-up, big trailers, nor hype cycle, but it didn't take long for people to notice it. A deck builder built around poker hands doesn't sound like something that would take off, and then it did. It dropped right alongside a wave of high-budget releases and still managed to break through, selling over 5 million copies in just a few weeks. Critics loved it, streamers couldn't stop playing it, and it even won Game of the Year at GDC, beating out some pretty massive names. What made it work was the design, fast, smart, insanely replayable, and it was all made by a solo developer. In a year packed with cinematic blockbusters, Balatro proved you could still break through with nothing but good mechanics and word of mouth. Journey is one of those games people still bring up when talking about how far indie games can go. It came out in 2012, right in the middle of a wave of high-budget action titles, and instead of combat or collectibles, it gave players a desert, a direction, and a stranger. There was no HUD, no dialogue, and no real tutorial. Just a minimalist world and an online system that let players silently explore it together. That same year, games like Mass Effect 3, Far Cry 3, and Assassin's Creed 3 were dominating headlines. But Journey quietly became a critical darling. It ended up sweeping the DICE Awards, winning 8 total, including Game of the Year, which no download-only indie had done before. It also became the first video game ever nominated for a Grammy and topped several Game of the Year lists from critics who usually don't hand those out to indies. At the time, people were calling it one of the most emotional games they'd ever played. And a lot of that praise still holds up today. It didn't rely on action or scale, it just delivered something different. Disco Elysium. Disco Elysium is one of the best examples of how far writing and design alone can take an indie game. It launched in 2019 up against big-budget RPGs with massive worlds and flashy combat, and somehow, this slow, text-heavy detective game with no traditional fighting ended up winning more awards than any other game that year. Just for perspective, Disco Elysium walked away with more awards than the critically acclaimed Death Stranding. In other words, Disco Elysium was the most awarded game of 2019 at the industry's biggest shows, a stunning feat for an indie with no combat and tons of text. Instead of combat skills, you leveled up parts of your personality. Conversations branched in every direction, and the writing was sharp enough that most AAA games couldn't touch it. Braid. Braid wasn't just an indie success, it was one of the games that made people start taking indie games seriously. It came out in 2008 during the Xbox Live Arcade era, at a time when the industry was focused on big HD releases like Gears of War 2 and Metal Gear Solid 4. Then along came this quiet puzzle platformer with oil painting visuals, time rewind mechanics, and a story that stuck with people way more than you'd expect from a 2D puzzle game. The gameplay looked simple, but each world messed with time in totally different ways. Some only moved forward when you moved, some rewound everything but you, and it all fed into a story that people were still debating years later. It was mostly made by one guy, Jonathan Blow, and it ended up winning awards, selling hundreds of thousands of copies in its first year, and becoming one of the highest-rated games of 2008. More importantly, Braid helped open the door for a new generation of indies. Games like Fez, Celeste, The Witness, and others that followed its example of thoughtful mechanics and personal storytelling. It proved you didn't need a giant team or a big publisher to make something unforgettable, just a smart idea and the nerve to do it differently. Looking back, a lot of today's best indies probably wouldn't exist without this one. The Walking Dead. The Walking Dead didn't seem like it was going to be a hit when it launched in 2012. It was episodic, slow-paced, and developed by Telltale, a modest team best known for smaller narrative games back then. And yeah, it had a big-name license, but this wasn't some big-budget tie-in. There was no action, barely any puzzles, just dialogue, decisions, and a whole lot of tension. But what really sold it was the writing, the characters, and especially the bond between Lee and Clementine, which ended up being one of the most emotional pairings in any game that year. It ended up selling over 28 million episodes in just a couple years, and picked up dozens of Game of the Year awards from various organizations and media outlets. Not bad for a game that barely had any traditional gameplay. Terraria. People love to call Terraria the 2D Minecraft, but that really doesn't do it justice. It launched in 2011, just a few months before Minecraft's full release, and at first it definitely rode that wave. But it didn't take long to show it had way more going on under the hood. It had a full progression system, bosses, crafting, loot, gear, magic, and a sense of discovery that felt way closer to a side-scrolling RPG than a sandbox builder. And the wild part is that it never stopped growing. Over a decade later, it had racked up over 58 million copies sold, placing it among the best-selling games of all time. For perspective, that puts it just under Red Dead Redemption 2 and ahead of most Zelda, Final Fantasy, and even individual Mario titles. And it did that with no $100 million budget. At one point, the devs even scrapped a spin-off just to free up some budget and keep improving the original. And even today, it's still one of the highest-rated games on Steam. While a ton of live service AAA games launched and died, Terraria just kept doing its thing, quietly becoming one of the most successful indie games ever made. Stardew Valley. Stardew Valley started as one guy's attempt to bring back the classic Harvest Moon experience because nothing else really scratched that itch. And somehow, he ended up making something bigger. Eric Barone, aka Concerned Ape, spent over 4 years building Stardew Valley entirely by himself. Programming, pixel art, music writing, all of it. He reportedly worked 10 hours a day and 7 days a week until it was done. When it launched in early 2016, it didn't just get attention, it sold over 1 million copies in its first 2 months, which was faster than a lot of AAA games that year. And you know what? It didn't stop. By 2022, it had passed 20 million copies sold, outperforming big-name titles like Dishonored 2, Watch Dogs 2, and even Final Fantasy 15. Every update since launch has been free, and there have been a lot of them. It became the go-to farming sim of its era, often referenced more than any AAA simulation or RPG game during that time. During the pandemic, it found a whole new wave of players who needed something calm to disappear into. Hades. Hades didn't launch with a ton of marketing or a big publisher behind it, but when it hit 1.0 in 2020, it landed hard. Built by a team of around 20 people at Supergiant Games, it came out of early access into a year packed with massive AAA releases and still ended up stealing a lot of the spotlight. It took the roguelike formula and fused it with a fully voiced, branching narrative that changed dynamically between runs, something no other roguelike had really pulled off with this level of depth, voice acting, and character reactivity. Unlike most roguelikes where death resets everything, Hades actually weaves it into the story. The narrative moves forward every time you die, with new dialogue, character reactions, and story beats that build on your last run. It sold over 1 million copies in just a few weeks, outpacing all of Supergiant's previous games combined. At the BAFTAs, it even swept 5 awards, including Best Game, beating out The Last of Us Part 2. And to top it off, it made history as the first video game ever to win a Hugo Award. Outer Wilds. Outer Wilds didn't launch with much fanfare, but it didn't take long for people to realize it was something special. Made by a small indie team, it launched in 2019 without much noise, and then slowly became one of the most celebrated games of its time. You're dropped into a handcrafted solar system stuck in a 22-minute time loop, and that's the entire premise. No quest markers, no leveling up, just pure discovery. You're expected to explore, learn, fail, and piece things together completely on your own, and that's what made it special. It trusted the player to figure everything out. It was one of the few games that truly outshined AAA on innovation alone, doing something most big-budget games wouldn't even dare to attempt. And somehow, that design choice paid off. Critics praised how it told a complete emotional story entirely through exploration, without traditional gameplay systems or guided progression. It didn't make billions, it didn't trend on Twitch, but it was a slow burn, a bold risk, and one of the most quietly brilliant indie games ever made. I'm sure I missed a few, or maybe even a lot, so if there's one you think belongs here, toss it in the comments. Have a wonderful day, and I'll see you in the next video.